through this for a bit. But this is low frequency noise and infrasound measured at 1,000 feet from wind turbines in Germany. Okay? Similar type models that we're talking about, potentially using in this project. And these are modern, large wind turbines. And so what the first thing is, again, so Rob was talking to you, this is the demarcation line. So everything on this side is the frequency where you get low frequency noise. Everything on this side is infrasound. And what this band here is, this pink band, that's the infrasound, low frequency noise, coming from the wind turbine that they've measured. They know it's just the turbine itself at 1,000 feet. Okay? Knowing that we're talking about 1,800 feet, I think outer grid's using a design goal of 1,800 feet, no closer than 1,800 feet to a home in this project. So you can see that, yeah, we can measure it. So now let's put it in perspective. So this is this line here, that's the perception threshold. Wrong one. This one here is the perception threshold. So that is the can you hear it? And you can see that we're well below a number, sort of 50 to 70, and as you go up in the frequency, it drops a bit, but we're well below your perception threshold of the infrasound. This is an international guideline or a standard that comes out of Australia, where they've suggested that this should be the level which is essentially 5 decibels less than the hearing threshold. For when the wind turbine was off, okay, and then they just had a wind speed of 10 meters per second, so a relatively windy day in the exact same field where they were measuring this, that's what the green line is. So you can see that the infrasound and low frequency noise coming from the turbine is very similar to when it's not operating at all either. The wind has a big component of infrasound, low frequency noise. For everybody who drove over tonight, you drove over in your cars with the windows up, this is the level of infrasound and low frequency noise that you were getting as you're driving in your car. Okay, it's all around us. So then the question becomes, well, where is an unacceptable level? The unacceptable level of infrasound, low frequency noise, or certainly on the infrasound side, tends to be above 100. And we don't get anywhere close to that with wind turbines. And what happens to you above 100? You get migraine headaches, you get all sorts of stuff, and you actually have to in order to get that level, you pretty much have to put somebody in the lab and have very specialized equipment to reach that level of infrasound. We just don't see it in our daily lives. Okay, so there's nothing that really emits that. So I guess the take home that I would say is that if infrasound low frequency noise coming from turbines, yes. Is it low enough that it doesn't pose a health impact? Yes. And you got to remember, there's 50,000 of these turbines or more all over the U.S. in areas similar to where you folks live here, as well as, candidly, in some areas of Texas where all there is cattle for 100 miles around. But so, we have over 50,000 turbines up in the U.S. right now. So with siting guidelines, again, as high as 50 decibels, 45 has become, let's see if I can not knock that over, 45 has become a fairly common standard around. Again, this is other sources of infrasound. This was a study out of Australia. This is at about 300 feet from the wind turbine. This is, again, somewhere around 1,000 feet. So they get infrasound at 72 decibels, 61 decibels as they get about 1,000 feet, similar to what I showed you in the Germany study. And this is just other sources and common sources. So at a beach house, 250 meters from the coastline, 25 meters, they were at, measuring infrasound for the waves at 75. Living near roadways. We're living with infrasound and low frequency noise in our daily lives. So then to come back to that question that I said before, on if you audible sound level at 45 decibels, is that equally protective of the infrasound low frequency noise? This is a paper that I and my colleagues published a couple of years ago now. And what we did was we looked at all the infrasound low frequency noise data, things like Rob had said. In fact, what Mr. Ambrose had measured in Falmouth, took all of that data from around the world that was available, and then we compared it to other limits and the design and setback goals, and we could say that, if you're setting a design goal of 45 decibels and 1,800 feet away from people's homes, it'll be equally protective. There are other issues. I'm not going to try to go through this a little bit faster now. So this is, perceptual response and reported health effects. Again, Health Canada asking, were there health impacts? And again, they did not see that as a peer-reviewed study. Very quickly on ice throw, I know that Scott tells me that it has been a concern in the community. The setback distance, if you were to look at an 1,800-foot setback from somebody's home, you're well protective of ice throw and blade failure as well. This is a report that came out of a group that's now actually called DNVGL, where they modeled a scenario of being 1,000 feet from somebody's home, being near a roadway, wind turbine near a roadway, and what they called the ever-present farmer in the field during icing conditions. And what they were looking at was, what is the probability that you'd actually be struck by ice? So they said, the probability is 1 ice strike per 62,000 years to a home if you're 1,000 feet away, knowing we're almost double that distance here. That 1 vehicle strike in 100,000 years. Clearly, traffic accident rates for ice are a lot more than that. This is basically a non-perceptible risk. And if you were an ever-present farmer in the field during the time when the icing conditions were happening to throw, the actual probability of being struck would only be 1 in 500 years. These are probabilities that are much less than what we deal with in our daily lives. This is the, you don't have to just believe me, other supporting government medical agency studies that I would put to you are very much in line with what I've told you folks today. So you've got the Australians, the Canadians, Massachusetts Department of Health here, Wisconsin Siting Board, and others. With their things. So having looked at the proposed ordinance that you folks have put together, I would suggest that very common right now across the U.S., certainly across other developments in New York, you don't know where the state's going to necessarily land, but that 45 decibels outside the exterior of homes is more than sufficient to protect the residents of your community. You're not going to see the sleep impacts. We've seen that from the international studies, not just the wind turbines, the World Health Organization side, and that 1,800 feet, which is the design goal to the house, and property lines gets tricky. Personally, I think the setback distances should be to homes, and really the setback distance isn't as critical as the decibel level. And I'd suggest 45 is something that you could consider. And with that, I think that's all that Rob and I have for formal discussion. And Mr. Chair to take any questions to you or Pat.
Let's start with that. I got a question. Some of the findings recommend a daytime level, a different lower one at nighttime, versus one level for both evening and night. Is that one level commonplace?
It really varies. It depends on the state, depends on the county, to be honest. Often it could go with a single number, but there are jurisdictions that do have a daytime and a nighttime. But I would suggest if you're looking at a daytime, nighttime, that it's that 45 decibels would be the nighttime number. And daytime numbers, typically where there are jurisdictions where you have daytime ordinances or sound levels, you're usually in the 55 to 60 decibel range. So if you're looking at, Department of Transport, if you're looking at other jurisdictions, the UK, some of these areas, the daytime number tends to be quite a bit higher. Now, candidly, with some of the wind ordinances, depending on where you look, you have numbers that are lower than what I've just suggested to you. But again, it's based on not so much the science, but on a desire to keep levels lower. But for most developers, whatever you set as the lower number is pretty much what's going to happen. Most wind projects don't tend to ramp up power during the day, and you basically have to curtail them at night if that's the case. So usually the projects are designed to just meet whatever that lower standard
They're
is.
designed to the nighttime guideline. Yeah, typically what we see is the daytime guideline might be 10 decibels higher than nighttime, but for a 24-hour day source, you're going to design for a nighttime guideline.
And maybe if I can add, there was somewhere earlier was brought up about what Vermont's recently done. In fact, Vermont had a draft standard, Public Services Board had a draft standard of 35 at night. Their final rule came out at 39 decibels at night, and they chose that. So it wasn't 35, it was 39 is what the final rule.
And is this figure outside or inside of premise?
So it's outside, and so typically, there have been some jurisdictions, Vermont was one of them, where they try to regulate the inside, which is a very bad idea. Nobody ever does that. I think there's the only ones in the world that I know of. But what we do with this, I'm going to knock this thing over. What we do with this outside design goal, it's actually meant to then be protective of the interior with the windows open. So when you look at the World Health Organization documents, when you look at Department of Transport document here in the US, there's an attenuation or a muffling factor from outside to inside. So with windows open in summertime, for your outside noise, if it was 45, you'd be at 35. Somewhere between 30 and 35, maybe a little bit louder in the bedroom. So that's where anywhere that has a jurisdictional design for a sound standard, it's to make sure that whatever is exterior is going to be lower inside. So you'll hear that a good nighttime noise level in your bedroom is somewhere between 30 to 35. That's a nice thing to try to target. Most people's houses aren't that quiet, but that's where the design standard from outside to inside, because there is even when it goes up and a decrease in the sound.
And the second question is on the setback. Sometimes there is a set footage, for example, like 2,000 feet, or 5 to 10 times your tower height. In your experience, which one keeps more people happy?
So where we're now starting to see this turbine height side of things is that's more of a recent phenomenon because the towers are getting bigger. So what you've seen is some jurisdictions go to a X times the height of turbines, 5 times, 10 times, 3 times, all over the map, and that was really to account for the height side. Then there's others that, very common across the Midwest, there's a 1,000-foot setback. And and in some cases, now I don't know any developers that are kind of designed to do 1,000 feet anymore. It's pretty much 1,400 feet has become sort of the minimum, 1,400 to 1,500 feet from residents. Which one's better? To be honest with you, I'm not as worried about the setback as I am about the sound level. Because and what happens is, and when Rob can tell you from experience, when we look at the sound level modeling that they do, before, let's say if it was designed to 45, the home, and then you start to look at those setback distance, how far you need to be away. You're typically, these days, you're somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 feet, depending on the project and the layout.
Right, you want to set the sound level first, because that's going to get people to have a good night's sleep. And that'll be, whatever turbine height and model people are looking at, you'll have to take that into account. And the height, in my experience, has generally been more of a safety concern. In other words, the X times the tip height, you want to have that so much back from a property line. Usually it's 1.1 or something like times the tip height in case there's a blade failure or something like that. That rare occasion that does happen. That's more of a safety issue. The sound decibel limit is going to take care of. You make everyone always happy? No, but that's going to be that balance of getting people a good night's sleep with the decibel limit.
And the other thing I maybe I'll just add a little bit to that too is that typically those setback distances, whether they be a X times the height or a distance, is to the house, not to the property lines. And because the reason that those were set in was, again, very closely aligned with and mimic the target sound level. So you can, as Rob said, you set your target sound level first, and if we know that it's 45, if it was to be 45 decibels, we know that we're going to have to be at least 1,500 feet, if not more back. But you don't set a overly aggressive setback distance in order to then negate then your sound level. So kind of match it up. And it is, some jurisdictions just have a sound level, some jurisdictions just have a distance, some have both.
My last question is, I would think that there's a big difference between the wind device at 400 foot versus 600 feet for noise generation.
I'll let Rob talk about that.
Surprisingly, there's a little difference. I guess there's two parts to my answer. There's the inherent sound from the unit itself, the sound power of the unit. As the units have gotten bigger and taller, they've gotten a little bit louder, but not very much. All the manufacturers now are incorporating low noise trailing edge technology and different things into the blades to minimize the increases in sound, even though the turbines are getting taller and there's so much more power. The megawatt size of it is also increasing. The height of it is just sort of taken into account when you do the modeling. So whether it's 400 feet or 600 feet, that calculation of distance is absolutely taken into account when you do the model.
Give me a ballpark about what percent increase it might be from 400 to 600.
So I'm thinking 400 now, you're talking the older turbines, probably a GE 1.5, such as the ones that went up, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And those were typically 104 plus 2, so 106 decibel sound power,
Okay.
ballpark. The newer ones that may be 3 megawatts, something like that, 3.2 megawatts, that could be 500, 600 feet tall, we're seeing those typically around 106 plus 2, so 108, so maybe 2 decibels louder.
Wow.
So are they a little bit louder? Yes, but not much.
And I think that's sort of the key, is to make sure that you've got, that's why I don't like a setback distance only, because that's the key, is that no matter how tall they are, no matter how loud that sound pressure level coming out of the turbine height, that's where, you know, making sure that you've got the right number of the homes. You know, if you have to, if they are a little bit louder, in fact, there are some of the older ones that are louder than some of the bigger, newer ones, right? And so, so in that case, what you're looking at is trying to make sure that you're, whatever the setback has to be. So let's say, you know, if you had a 45 decibel sound limit, and let's say that was 1,800 feet, depending on the turbine model that you, that was the closest you could be to get to 45. Or maybe, let's say it was a little bit louder model they chose, maybe you have to be at 2,000. 2,100 feet, so that whatever that fluctuating number is, the key is that they got to model to that number of the house. And as Rob was telling you, you've got a very good, and there's been a lot of work done around the world that the models match up to reality.
Rob, could you just explain why you added 2 decibels to your number?
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, so the 2 decibels is sort of a safety factor. The manufacturers recommend uncertainty. So that's sort of a margin of safety, if you will, that the manufacturer recommends. They have a typical sound level, which is the 104, the 106 I mentioned, but then to be conservative, we add the additional 2 decibels. The other point on the trade-offs of the older turbines, say at 400 feet, if you've got a GE 1.5 and now you've got a GE 3 megawatt, well, you needed 2 of those GE 1.5 to get to 1 3 megawatt machine. So you get the same power now with fewer turbines. So on a net basis, it's not loud.
What about wind direction? If it's coming directly at the tower or off at an angle from the tower, does that make a difference in the sound produced?
They are tested under a variety of wind speed and directional conditions. Those are taken into consideration in the sound data that the manufacturers provide. And then we take that, put it into the model. Like I said, we assume it's blowing in any different direction. It's unidirectional.
Yeah, so I guess what Rob means by that, if the house was right there in the middle of the square here, and let's say all of us around here were turbines in the project area, why we know the models are actually doing a good job of over-predicting, which is what we want, is because what Rob assumes is that every day the wind's blowing from all these directions and the sound's going to that house. Now clearly, if the wind was blowing from this direction, you'd get the sound from these nice wind turbines right here at that house, but you wouldn't hear the sound coming from you folks. You would get a little
greatly reduced.
Yeah, greatly reduced.
Yes.
You'd get some from Rob and me and some from these folks here. But so that's why the model is inherently conservative, is they try to make it a worst case. So because one of the things is they can't underpredict, and the reason they can't underpredict is you gotta do post-construction monitoring in New York, right, after. So they actually do, like, let's say the project was approved, and let's say the state, you know, and you folks and all the approvals are there, and then Evergreen builds the project. There's a requirement in New York, which isn't always the case, to actually go out and then they have to test, monitor the sound to make sure that what they modeled is actually correct. And that all has to be filed with the state and everything else. So they have to demonstrate compliance. And if they don't, and let's say Rob screws up his modeling. Okay, so Scott pays Rob a bunch of money, Rob screws up the modeling.
Thanks, Chris.
Scott's not gonna be very happy if he goes out after and Rob or somebody measures and finds that they're out of compliance. Because then what has to happen is the turbines have to be what we call curtailed. They have to be turned down. They have to meet that number, whatever that number is going to be. If it was 45, they have to meet 45. If they don't, they have to curtail it. What does that mean to them? That means they don't make as much money. So that's why the models have to line up with the real world. If they don't, tend to be a whole lot of unhappy developers later on, and projects that would, quite frankly, and there are projects where this isn't always perfect. There are projects that have been built that have been out of compliance in the US. And they have been, not speaking of any one specifically here right now, but they have been curtailed. And they have been
Madison County.
brought down. So you do have that extra level of protection in New York, which you don't necessarily in all states and all counties, that they are gonna have to demonstrate after, whatever that sound compliance level is, they're gonna be.
I have a question.
Yep.
If your target at a residence is 45 dBA,
1,800 to 2,500 feet, what is your dBA at the site, at the base of tower? Then? A ballpark, I mean, it doesn't.
If you're standing at the base of the tower,
Yep.
typically that's around 60 decibels.
Yeah, that's my experience,
Yeah.
somewhere in that neighborhood.
Somewhere in that.
Somewhere in that neighborhood, yeah.
Okay.
Plus or minus a few decibels.